So, what ever happened to one of the most iconic and classic rock bands to ever appear out of the incredible era of the 1970s? Boston? Let's find out. Movies,
Music and monsters.
Hey guys, Dan Monroe here, talking about movies, music, and monsters. Oh man, Boston, without a doubt. Their debut album from 1976 is absolutely on my very short list of albums if I were indeed stranded on a desert island. That, along with probably Abbey Road by the Beatles, Foreigner 4, and maybe 2 or 3 others sprinkled in on the top for good measure. But this album and this group, I mean, come on, what can you say? Unbelievable musicians, unbelievable songwriters coming together to make a very distinct impact on rock and roll in the 1970s and still today. So grab your favorite spaceship in the shape of a guitar, crank up the old turntable with a bucket of stale popcorn, and let's dive in. Okay, Tom Scholz, the man behind the sound of Boston. No question, this guy was not your typical rock star and really had no desire to be at all. He was basically a gearhead, obsessed with finding new and innovative sounds to incorporate into his music. Super smart guy with a degree from MIT, working during the day at Polaroid as an engineer and at night in his very small basement studio trying to formulate sounds to make rock and roll history, and boy, oh boy, did he ever. Scholz wanted to create a sound that was huge, enormous, and he started playing guitar after hearing Jimmy Page, Led Zeppelin, Jeff Beck, among others, with his 12-track recording studio in his basement. Gotta love seeing the vintage analog gear in this guy's studio. Check out the old Revox B77 reel-to-reel. These were awesome, and I literally grew up listening to these exact same units. My dad had several Revox recorders back in the day, which really inspired my love for analog tape, which I still love and still listen to today. Anyway, Scholz was, to say the least, a perfectionist. He had a very clear vision that really nobody else shared with him at the time, which certainly was on full display for Boston's debut album, Boston. I mean, a lot of bands back in the 1970s that tried recording albums at home were, shall we say, not really all that successful. Some were, but the passion and dedication to the sound that he wanted was so unique, it was almost impossible to ignore it.
I used a 12-track Scully tape recorder. I basically had to make do with what I had. In the back of my mind, I always had a guitar sound that I was always striving for. I knew it when I heard it. I would just keep experimenting with the equipment until I managed to stumble onto the sound. Every time I record a song, it's always with equipment with new settings. But when I get there, I know it.
I love the wordage on the album. No synthesizers used, no computers used, real artists, real instruments, real talent. I mean, think about it. This debut demo album was pretty much just him alone in his basement with a bunch of guitars and freaky gadgets, many of which he literally created himself from scratch and then later on sold to us. The Tom Scholz Rockman comes to mind. I mean, come on, what guitarist in the 1980s didn't have one of these? Scholz began shopping his demo tape around, which eventually found its way to CBS Records, and when the executives heard the demo, they were stunned, quite frankly, that this kind of quality came from some guy's basement. But they concluded that doing a major release with a quote-unquote homemade recording was a bit on the risky side and wanted it re-recorded.
When I got the CBS contract, they came down and told me, we can't possibly make an actual real record here.
So, realizing they'd rather not lose this kind of incredible talent, CBS gave Scholes the green light to go back into his own basement and re-record the album again.
He opens the door and he starts to go out and he says, you make the record here by yourself. Bring the masters to LA, we'll mix it in LA.
Enter Brad Delp. Holy Jiminy Christmas, what a set of pipes on this guy. I mean, seriously, have you listened to this guy sing? It's hard to imagine that you could add another dimension of brilliance to these Tom Scholz recordings, but there's no way to deny the fact that Brad's vocals not only complemented the sound, but to me was that final polished icing on the cake that pushed this band rapidly right over the top.
We were turned down by every major label, including the label that eventually signed us. And they all said, well, that's not really what we're looking for at this time. So I think it was a little different for the time. We thought it was either going to do real well or just zero. It didn't sound to me like other things on the radio. I didn't know if that was going to be a plus or not. And fortunately, it just took off right away.
By the way, if anybody out there would like to listen to the original demos that Tom Scholz and the boys recorded in his basement, the recordings that CBS heard before wanting them re-recorded, well, you can, right here in this place. Just do a search, look around, you'll find them. Now, the only song on this debut album that was not recorded in Tom Scholz's basement was the last song, Let Me Take You Home Tonight, which was recorded in a studio in LA with all the band members that you see on the album. And if you pay really close attention with musically enthusiastic ears, you can tell that this last song has a bit of a different sound than the rest of the songs on the album, which of course they would have to be, two completely different recording studios. Now, believe it or not, as crazy as this sounds, the band at the time that the album was completed didn't even have a name yet, but the producer of the album recommended the name Boston, and that was it. Boston it was, and their debut album was released in the summer of 1976 and took not only the music industry by storm, but also the audiences at home spinning their LPs at 33 RPM, more than a feeling foreplay, long-time rock and roll band. These were not just songs. These were sonic experiences that honestly inspired an entire genre of stadium rock sound, becoming rapidly one of the most successful and profitable debut albums of any band of all time, selling over 17 million copies and literally launching this band to worldwide rock status almost overnight. This album also opened up an entire new world for bands and individual artists doing their own recordings, knowing that Boston had already done it, almost launching the home recording industry for those who could afford it at the time, but eventually spawning over into those wonderful little 4-track cassette units from the early 1980s. I'll never, ever forget my first 4-track cassette, and in fact, I still have it, which then led to 6-track cassette, 8-track cassette, 8-track ADAT, 3 ADATs linked together for 24 tracks digital, then computers, DAWs, Pro Tools. I had them all, and probably if you're a musician my age, you did too. Boston signed a 10-year album deal with CBS that would last 6 years, which seems like a lot, but that actually was pretty standard back in those days. Well, Scholz finally quit his job at Polaroid, and Boston went out on the road touring alongside Foghat, Blue Oyster Cult, and even Black Sabbath, and of course, By this time, the record label was interested in making more money and was pressuring Schultz for another album, which eventually was released as Don't Look Back, which did hit number 1 on the charts and sold over 7 million copies, even though Schultz, to this day, still considers this album to be rushed, even though it was delivered a year later than the record label wanted. After the grueling Don't Look Back tour, both Schultz and Brad Delp were, in a way, thinking of going the way of the Beatles, stopping touring completely and just focusing on making great albums in the recording studio. And when the time came for Boston's third album, Third Stage, the label really put Schultz between a rock and a hard place by wanting to withhold royalty payments until the third album was released. Good. Record executives. Well, when that didn't work, things got worse. The record label sued Tom Scholz in 1984 for breach of contract. Scholz then countersued the record label for unpaid royalties, and these cases went on for years. But luckily, in the end, Tom Scholz won. All of this nonsense going on while trying to produce a third record. I mean, holy crap, what the heck? Well, out with the old and in with the new, Tom Scholz signed a new record deal with MCA, which of course pissed off CBS, who then sued MCA with a cease and desist order, but CBS lost that case as well in 1985. But it did leave Tom Scholz to finally be able to do what he wanted when he wanted, more or less, and allowed him to finally get back to finishing the third album in 1986. The album Third Stage eventually went platinum, selling about 4 million units, and the band once again hit the road to go on tour, but Brad Delp quit the band, and instantly, just like that, the recognizable voice of the band was gone, leaving Tom Scholz as the one and only remaining original member who started planning Boston's fourth album, Walk On, released in 1994, this time with a new lead singer named Fran Cosmo. The record did okay, never hit the top 5, but did eventually become platinum, and did have a pretty decent single called I Need Your Love. Well, as luck would have it, as Boston began preparations to go on tour to support this new album, Brad Delp rejoined the band. And this is where things start to get really weird. It took 8 years until the next album came out, Corporate America, in 2002. And since Boston was no longer on a major label, Tom Scholz uploaded the album to mp3.com under the name Downer's Revenge, rather than Boston. As strange as that seems from what I've read, it's because musical trends in America had changed quite a bit, and Tom Scholz really didn't think people would buy the record if it had the Boston name on it or something like that. I don't know. It's bizarre. And the album really didn't do anything at all. In fact, I don't even remember having even heard of it. It didn't chart in the top 40. And because of that, you guessed it, another lawsuit. Tom Scholz sued the independent label, Artemis, claiming that the album was under-publicized. Ay, ay, ay. Then, sadly and suddenly, in March of 2007, Brad Delp died in his home in New Hampshire, which, rather than bringing the remaining members of the band together, pretty much just tore them apart. But the remaining members did hold a tribute concert in Brad's memory called Come Together, a tribute to Brad Delp. Now, I would have to say that it's probably a fair bet to assume that over 99.9% of you have heard this album, or at least most of it. But If you haven't, do yourself a freaking favor and check it out. Grab a copy, have a seat with your favorite beverage, and spend 38 minutes discovering or rediscovering this amazing group. And if you really want to treat yourself, do a search right here, in this place, for Boston Live 1979 at Giants Stadium, and listen to these guys pull off these songs live. Unfreaking believable. The sound, the drive, the freaking talent. Despite the incredible heights and the enormous blows that this band both rose to and overcame, there is no denying either the significant impact this band had on rock history, or maybe more importantly, the musical legacy left behind by these incredible musicians, taking their place with other unbelievably talented groups in rock and roll history like Chicago, Genesis, Motley Crue, Metallica, Guns N' Roses, Toto, Foreigner, and so many more. We could be here all day, but that, my friends, is the topic of another video. I really hope you guys enjoyed that deep dive into the band Boston, and if you did, and you like this kind of stuff, please consider subscribing to the channel. I've got a whole ton of new videos coming up really soon that I know you guys are just gonna dig. And please feel free to stop back anytime as we together continue the conversation on movies, music, and monsters.
Movies, music, and monsters.